What if the greatest power struggle of our era is unfolding so quietly that most people don't even notice it? Not through wars or speeches or dramatic confrontations, but through slow decisions, silent investments, and strategic moves scattered across oceans, ports, tech labs, and diplomatic backrooms. What if the United States and China are already locked in a global competition that shapes every economy, every supply chain, every future technology, and every political alliance without anyone admitting it openly? It begins far away from Washington or Beijing, in a place most people would never expect: Latin America. For decades, this region wasn't just influenced by the United States, it was shaped by it. Policies, money, military partnerships, trade deals, everything revolved around Washington. But quietly, almost invisibly, that grip started slipping, and China stepped in without fanfare, without noise, without giving the world a headline to latch onto. Ports began to change ownership, railways were modernized, energy grids were financed, highways appeared where none existed. 5G towers rose. Loan deals were signed that stretch 20, 30, even 40 years into the future, all done in the background. No shouting, no threats, no America First speeches, just results. And while China built concrete, steel, and influence, the US responded with meetings, warnings, diplomatic visits, and promises of support. But Latin America had heard promises before. They were tired of lectures. They wanted investment. And China delivered. This region, once a one-way street of American influence, slowly transformed into a geopolitical marketplace where two superpowers quietly compete for loyalty. But Latin America is just the first domino. Move across the world and the silence disappears, replaced by tension you can feel in the water. The South China Sea, one of the most contested, strategic, and dangerous places on Earth. China keeps expanding its artificial islands, turning reefs into military installations with runways, sensors, missiles, and ports. The US answers with warships slicing through those waters, performing what it calls freedom of navigation missions. Two superpowers, two visions, one region, and every year, the gap between peace and conflict gets thinner. A single mistake, one pilot misjudging distance, one captain misunderstanding a move, could spark something no one can control, and yet both sides push forward. Because whoever controls these waters controls the trade arteries of the modern world. It's not land they're fighting over, it's leverage. But the real battle, the battle that will decide the next century, isn't happening on the ocean. It's happening in technology labs, chip foundries, AI research centers, and quantum facilities. The United States is trying to stop China from buying or developing the world's most advanced semiconductors, not because of competition, but because chips are the brain of everything: drones, jets, missiles, AI systems, infrastructure, encryption. Whoever leads in chips leads in military power, economic power, and global influence. What if the greatest power struggle of our era is unfolding so quietly that most people don't even notice it? Not through wars, or so Washington began blocking exports, pressuring allies, forming new tech alliances, and even pushing companies around the world to stop selling anything advanced to China. Meanwhile, China poured billions into domestic chip manufacturing, started building alternative supply chains, and began a national campaign to become independent in AI and semiconductor technology. Because China knows something simple: no country can rise if someone else controls its brain. And this battle is not theoretical. It's happening right now. American companies are caught in the crossfire. European suppliers are pressured to choose sides. And US politicians keep arguing publicly, some calling for cooperation, others for confrontation, and some making loud promises that ignore complex reality. Even Trump, during his time, treated the tech war like a public show, throwing tariffs like they were part of an election ad, without caring how many American farmers, businesses, and allies got dragged into the mess. And the world watched a superpower behave like a reality TV contestant rather than a stable leader. But technology is just one part of the story, because as the US and China compete, the world has begun to split into blocs again. Not officially, not openly, but slowly, through alliances, trade routes, military deals, and political alignments. On one side, the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, South Korea, economies that have been tied together for decades through NATO, trade partnerships, and shared values. On the other side, China, Russia, Iran, parts of Africa, much of the Middle East, and large parts of the global south. Not because they love China, but because they're tired of US pressure, tired of sanctions, tired of being told how to run their governments, tired of the dollar controlling everything they do. And while the world divides, another shift begins, one that could reshape every product we use, every company we depend on, every supply chain that keeps the world running, decoupling, or, as American politicians say when they want to sound calm, de-risking. US companies are moving factories away from China, but they're not coming back home. They're going to India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, anywhere that isn't Beijing's backyard. Apple is building devices outside China. Automakers are shifting production lines. Tech companies are diversifying because they understand the risk. Being too dependent on one superpower in a time of rivalry is a gamble no one wants to take. But China is not standing still. It's building its own versions of Western technologies, replacing American software with Chinese software, replacing foreign suppliers with domestic ones, strengthening its trade with countries that don't want to choose sides. The world economy is slowly rewiring itself. And beneath all this, the military race intensifies. China is building the world's largest navy, not louder, not flashier, but faster, ship after ship after ship. Meanwhile, the US strengthens alliances with Japan, Australia, the Philippines, even NATO partners, expanding interest into the Indo-Pacific. Everyone is preparing for a future no one wants to admit out loud, because both sides understand the next global conflict won't just be fought on land or sea. It will be fought through chips, data, supply chains, influence networks, currencies, trade routes, and ideology. And the scariest part, this competition is no longer about winning, it's about not falling behind. But as the world keeps watching this silent storm grow, another question emerges. If the United States and China are locked in this colossal competition, who is really gaining ground? Because while Washington tries to reassure the world that it's still the undisputed global leader, the signals on the ground tell a different story. Countries that once relied fully on American guarantees are now hedging, adjusting, balancing. Even longtime US partners in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa are quietly diversifying their alliances, not because they love China, but because they can no longer fully depend on Washington's attention, consistency, or stability. And yes, bro, one major reason behind this global doubt is the political roller coaster inside the United States. The world still remembers how Trump disrupted long-standing alliances, questioned NATO, demanded payments from partners, and launched unpredictable tariffs that hurt not just China, but American allies too. Whether you support him or not, the shockwaves of those 4 years made many countries wonder what future American leadership would look like. And now, with US politics becoming more polarized than ever, those questions have only intensified. While Washington debates internally, Beijing moves externally, quietly, strategically, relentlessly. Take Latin America. For the past 20 years, the region was basically America's backyard. But China entered with a different playbook. No lectures on democracy, no conditions about human rights, no political strings attached. Only money, infrastructure, roads, ports, power plants, and loans. Billions and billions. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Chile saw an opportunity that the US hadn't given them in decades. Washington kept promising partnership, but Beijing delivered bulldozers, engineers, ports, and railroads. This shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, silently, until suddenly China became the largest trading partner for major economies in the region. The US is now trying to counter this, but it feels like a late response to a race China started long ago. Diplomats visit, US officials promise investments, but China already planted roots deep into the economic soil of Latin America. And once infrastructure is built, ports, rails, electricity grids, it becomes nearly impossible to compete with or replace. But Latin America is only one chapter. Because if there is one region where the US-China rivalry could actually spark a real conflict, it's the South China Sea. Imagine a giant chessboard made of water, trade routes worth trillions, strategic choke points, islands that didn't exist 15 years ago, now turned into military fortresses. China has turned reefs into runways, tiny rocks into naval bases, and isolated waters into zones of control. Step by step, they changed the map, not with war, but with concrete, sand, and engineering. The US, of course, refuses to accept this. American warships sail through the waters claiming freedom of navigation, while Chinese vessels shadow them, follow them, dare them to come closer. Each encounter is a moment where a miscalculation could turn into a global crisis. One wrong move, one collision, one misunderstood signal, and the world could face the most dangerous confrontation since the Cold War. But the real war, the real decisive battle, is not happening on the ocean. It's happening inside microchips. The world is entering an era where whoever controls the most advanced semiconductors controls the future. AI, supercomputers, weapon systems, satellites, energy grids, financial systems, everything depends on chips smaller than your fingernail. The US knows this. China knows this. And that is why the semiconductor war has become the new nuclear arms race. Washington has banned the export of high-end chips to China. Companies like NVIDIA cannot sell their most advanced AI processors. The Netherlands has been pressured not to sell China the world's most advanced lithography machines. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, all have been pulled into America's tech containment strategy. The goal is simple: slow China down. But China saw this coming years ago. Billions of dollars have been poured into domestic chip development. Factories are being built at record speed. Local companies are being pushed to innovate, even if it costs more. And while China is still behind on the cutting edge, the gap is shrinking faster than Washington expected. AI research is exploding. Quantum computing is accelerating. And the Chinese military is integrating AI into surveillance, targeting, and unmanned systems at a speed the Pentagon finds alarming. This is not just a contest of devices, it's a race to define the entire future, and that future is dividing the world. Countries no longer want to fully choose sides, but they feel forced to. Europe wants trade with China, but security with the US. India wants strategic partnership with Washington, but refuses to join anti-China blocs. The Middle East is inviting both the US and China. Africa is accepting Chinese infrastructure while hosting American military bases. The world is polarizing not into two hard camps, but into a complex web of interests, alliances, and contradictions. And at the center of it all are two giants moving toward confrontation while telling the world they don't want conflict. But actions speak louder than words. The US is shifting supply chains away from China. Companies are moving operations to India, Vietnam, and Mexico. Washington calls it de-risking, but Beijing sees it as containment. China is responding with its own restrictions: rare earths, drones, critical minerals. Each side tries to weaken the other without crossing the line into direct war. But the most dangerous part of this rivalry is the military buildup. China is expanding its navy at a speed nobody in history has matched. New destroyers, new submarines, new carriers. The US still has the stronger navy overall, but China has the home advantage and longer timelines. Beijing is preparing for the possibility that one day the US may intervene around Taiwan, and it wants to be ready. The US is strengthening alliances too. Japan is rearming. The Philippines is hosting new bases. Australia is buying nuclear-powered submarines through AUKUS. NATO is even beginning to mention China in its statements, something unthinkable a decade ago. The world is forming blocs, even if no one openly admits it. And as these two powers maneuver, adjust, and counter, every country on Earth is calculating what their next move should be. Because this is not just a rivalry, this is the shaping of the 21st century. But the real question, the one no world leader wants to say out loud, is this: what happens when two superpowers realize they cannot both dominate the same century? That's the silent fear shaping every summit, every treaty, every military exercise, every diplomatic handshake. Because deep down, everyone knows this rivalry is not temporary. It is structural. It is baked into the foundations of both countries. One rising, one refusing to decline, one expanding, one resisting. It is a collision course defined not by personalities, but by power. Still, personalities matter, and Chinese leaders watched every American president closely, from Obama's pivot to Asia, to Trump's tariff war, to Biden's strategic competition. But the Trump era especially left a lasting impact. Trump's unpredictability, one day praising Xi Jinping, the next day calling China the greatest threat in history, sent mixed signals to the world. His tariffs hurt China, but also hurt American farmers, manufacturers, and consumers. Countries saw Washington acting more like a solo actor than a team captain, and that confusion allowed Beijing to quietly slip into spaces America had left open. Even today, Chinese diplomats subtly remind nations of that chaos, saying, "How can you trust a country where every 4 years foreign policy changes completely?" That message lands harder than most Americans realize. And while Washington argues about domestic politics, China makes long-term plans, 20, 30, even 50 years ahead. It builds ports that will operate long after today's leaders are gone. It signs 99-year leases. It invests in mining projects that will deliver returns in 2045. It doesn't think in election cycles, it thinks in eras. And that difference, short-term versus long-term, gives Beijing an advantage in many parts of the world. But advantage does not mean victory, because China has weaknesses too: a slowing economy, a debt crisis in its property market, youth unemployment, a shrinking population, rising tension with neighbors like Japan, India, Vietnam. These vulnerabilities make Beijing more cautious, but also more determined to secure its influence before time runs out. This is why the competition is accelerating. Both sides feel pressure. The US believes it must stop China now before Beijing becomes too advanced to contain. China believes it must rise now before its demographics weaken and before the US fully encircles it. Two superpowers racing against clocks, different clocks, but both ticking loudly. And in the middle of all this, the rest of the world is learning to play both sides. Countries don't want to choose. They want Chinese money and American security. They want US technology and Chinese markets. They want investment from Beijing, but military protection from Washington. This balancing act is creating a world where neutrality becomes a strategy and ambiguity becomes a weapon. Look at Latin America again. Some countries sign infrastructure deals with China, but intelligence agreements with the US. Some buy Chinese cameras, but American jets. Some trade with China, but vote with the US at the UN. It's a diplomatic juggling act, and everyone is doing it because no one knows who will ultimately win. Meanwhile, in Asia, the tension feels sharper. Japan and South Korea rely on the US for security, but trade massively with China. The Philippines welcomes American troops, but doesn't want war in its waters. India clashes with China on the Himalayan border, but refuses to formally join any US-led alliance. Southeast Asian nations keep their warnings quiet, their strategies flexible, their loyalties optional. Everyone wants peace, but everyone is preparing for something else. Because beneath all the official statements about cooperation and dialogue, every country can feel it. The world is shifting. The balance of power is changing. And when power shifts, history teaches us that conflict becomes more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely. The US and China both say they do not want war. Maybe that's true. But a future war doesn't need intention. It only needs a mistake, a misread radar signal, a naval collision, an aircraft straying too close, a commander reacting too fast. One spark in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait could pull the whole world into a crisis nobody planned. And while leaders talk about diplomacy, militaries on both sides are preparing for the worst. China trains for blockades, missile strikes, and amphibious assaults. The US practices island-hopping missions, carrier group maneuvers, cyber operations, and rapid deployments. Both sides simulate scenarios where the other side strikes first. Both sides test weapons built not for deterrence, but for domination. The technology race intensifies this danger. AI-driven warfare removes human hesitation. Hypersonic missiles reduce reaction times. Autonomous drones can identify targets faster than a human blink. The faster the technology, the shorter the time to make life or death decisions. And the shorter the time, the higher the risk of miscalculation. All of this is happening at a moment when global institutions are weakening. The UN is divided. The World Trade Organization is stuck. Multilateral agreements are collapsing. Great powers are ignoring rules when convenient. Smaller countries feel pressured, cornered, overlooked. So the world drifts, not toward cooperation, but toward competition-driven fragmentation. But here's the twist, bro. Even though the US and China appear locked in a winner-takes-all contest, the world is no longer built for two superpowers. It's multipolar now. India, Europe, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, the Gulf states, everyone is rising in their own way. This makes the US-China struggle even more unpredictable, because in a multipolar world, alliances shift faster, interests collide more often, and opportunities for misalignment multiply. The US wants to stay the center of the global system. China wants to reshape that system. Others want to escape the system altogether. And the result is a planet caught between three forces: American dominance, Chinese ambition, everyone else's desire for independence. This is the storm the 21st century is moving into. As this rivalry intensifies, every nation must answer the same questions. Who will guarantee our security? Who will fuel our economy? Who will control our data, our networks, our technology? Who will shape our future? These are more than political questions. They are existential ones. And the world knows that whatever answer emerges in the next decade will define the next 100 years. This is the new global reality, a competition not just for power, but for time, influence, innovation, and narrative. A rivalry too big to avoid, too deep to resolve quickly, and too consequential to ignore. And now I want to leave your audience with a question. Do you think the US and China can share this century peacefully? Or are we slowly sliding toward a conflict that no one is ready for? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.